Well, the time has come. Today I'm going to start on that big Tularosa Black on white jar that I promised to do. 16 inches in diameter. Now some of you will remember the last time I tried a big Tularosa Black on white jar, it didn't end so well. And that's because a big jar is complicated. Making a big Oya is much more difficult than making a small jar. It's much more difficult than making 10 small jars. So I'm about to get started. Let's hope it goes better this time than it did last time. If you're hoping to follow along with me today, you're going to need a puki, in this case a very large puki. This one is glass, so I'm also going to need a bandana to keep the clay from sticking to the glass. A gourd scraper, a cutting tool, a scraping tool, a polishing stone, and of course a quantity of good clay. When making a pot of this size, the first challenge is to create a slab of clay large enough to fill that puki. Now some people have said a slab roller works great for this, and it does, but there are more inexpensive ways to create that slab, and one of those is using a rolling pin like I am here. And by rolling it out on a piece of cloth, it's easier to pick up. It doesn't stick to the table. Now you can see that my slab does fit in my puki, with a few exceptions. Around that one side, it doesn't quite reach it. So I'm going to spend some time now kind of changing the shape, right? Because it's not really round like I want. And what I want is about an inch or so of clay sticking up beyond the edge of the puki, so I have some place to attach that first coil. Because when I'm attaching the coil, I'm kind of pressing down into the clay body, and so I'm adding little coils around the edges. I'm trimming off excess, because what I want in the end is a nice perfect disc that's a little larger than my puki and extends out beyond the edge of it, like I said, about an inch or so. And so with some work, I achieved that, and now I'm ready to add my first true coil. I'm going to start building the walls up. Now I'm attaching it. As you see, I'm pressing that first coil down into the body, and that involves having a little bit of clay up beyond the edge of the puki. And then once you get that attached, you pinch it thin, and then scrape it on the outside, and then scrape it on the inside, and repeat as necessary. Okay, so that's the first coil. There's the slab, base, and one coil. Given what you know about this pot, it's 16 inches in diameter, about 12 inches tall. Take a guess at how many coils you think it's going to take to build a pot of this size. Go ahead and write it down so that you remember, and then I'm going to keep track, and at the end, go ahead and leave a comment on what you guessed it would take versus what it actually took, because I bet you can't guess how many coils this pot is going to require. So there is the second coil. That is 2 coils a pot. And now I'm going to walk away and let it firm up a bit before I come back and work on it. Round 2. Okay, this is about half hour later. I've just given that clay a chance to kind of firm up so that it doesn't sag. You want to sag down, below the edge of the puki. The first thing I'm going to do is kind of clean up that top edge, trim off any high spots, make sure it's all relatively even, and then I'm going to get it wet. Just because it sat and dried for a while, I want the top of the clay to be nice and damp, ready to accept that coil. Now I'm looking at the size of it. I'm not as wide as I need to be. Because the original pot is 16 inches in diameter, and because that clay is going to shrink when it dries, my pot needs to be about 17 inches in diameter, just so it'll shrink and be 16. So I'm not even 16 now, so I've got to keep that in mind as I build and keep trying to expand out, hopefully to reach that 17-inch diameter that I'm shooting for. Most of these Tularosa Oyas have a very round shape. They're real globular. But this one is quite a bit squat, or more squat than most. And I'm trying to reproduce not only the size of the original, but, roughly the shape as well. So I'm probably bringing this shape in a little faster than I would normally want to with a Tularosa. That's always the challenge to me, kind of keep the middle kind of going upwards before you start curving it in to make it rounded. Now the last one I did was, really round. This one, I'm purposely making it squat.
So here's the amount of clay I have left. Not even enough for a coil to go around. Well, maybe if I make it thin enough. But I definitely need more clay to finish this up. And that's kind of one of the problems when you're making a big pot like this is you need a lot of clay. And sometimes it's hard to guess how much clay you need. Now, I had a pretty good idea when I made this block of clay that I was going to need more. But also that's all my Rubbermaid bin would fit. So I thought I'll just make that up, make the pot, and then see what I need, make some more up. So what I'm going to do is wrap this up real good. I'm going to mix up another batch of clay, let it sit overnight, and then tomorrow finish this off. Once that clay's had a chance to sit and kind of become more plastic. So that's where I'm at. So I'm going to leave this for the night the way it is, and then tomorrow, you know, I've probably only got 3 or 4 more coils, you know, with those smallish coils I've been making to get this finished up. So.
I dig this clay up on the Mogollon Rim, real close to the same area where this type of pottery would have been made in ancient times. And I process it dry, and the advantage of dry processing clay is I have a whole bucket of this stuff already ground up, already has the appropriate amount of temper mixed in with it. So anytime I need more clay, I can just pour it out of the bucket, wet it like I'm doing here, mix it up, and you know I'm ready to use it in a couple of hours. So that's a lot faster than wet processing where you have to plan ahead to have enough clay for a project. If you'd like to learn more about dry processing clay, I'll put a link down in the doobly-doo to a video about how I dry process my clay. As I start the second day of building on this pot, the weather is warm and dry. Kind of typical spring weather for Arizona, but it makes the clay dry out way faster than you want it to. So at first, I just wet the upper edge of the pot just because I want that clay to be nice and damp and ready to accept that first coil. And then, typical, just bond the coil, pinch it flat, scrape it on the outside, scrape it on the inside. I'm just going to keep building. And now we're at coil number 6. How you doing on your guess? Now here I'm dealing with that warm, dry weather I talked about just a little bit ago. The bottom portion of the pot is getting way too dry while I work on the top. And I want this pot to dry relatively evenly. And so I'm trying to keep the bottom half wrapped in plastic. That is not easy to do. And you can see I fail at it quite a bit. But my intentions are to keep the bottom portion of the pot from drying while I continue to work on the top. You will notice that as I approach the neck, the coils I'm building with are considerably smaller than those I was using as I was building up the body, the outside of the pot. And that is just because as I'm bringing it in, it becomes a little more fragile. It's wanting to kind of sink and slump down. Gravity is pulling that damp clay in the center down. And so a smaller coil adds less weight as I build out. So these smaller coils allow me to keep building in, whereas a larger coil would add too much weight. Okay, one last coil before I start building the neck. We're getting close to the end. When you add the neck to a pot like this, it's really easy to get it off center, and that makes the whole pot look kind of weird and wonky. And so it really behooves you to take the time to make sure that the neck is centered. And so here I'm using a lid just to get a perfect circle, and I kind of eyeballed it, but just kind of take some extra time to make sure it is centered on there. And then you'll see as I'm adding this coil, I'm doing it differently than before. Instead of putting the coil on the side, I put the coil right on top because I'm adding the coil in the direction I want to form the walls. And then I'm pinching it straight up. When you're making a pot, you really want to take extra time on the neck and rim because that is where people are going to notice any inconsistencies. Here I am just putting little daubs of clay on there to fill in low spots, getting down and eyeballing it, trimming off high spots. The point being that I spent way more time on the neck and rim than any other part of this pot because it's important. And then I'll get a wet piece of buckskin and I'll go over it and smooth it all out. Even after I've smoothed it with the buckskin, I'll get back down and eyeball it again. And if I see any place that's high, I'll trim that off. Then I'll hit it with the buckskin again. So that wraps up the building phase of this pot. 11 coils. Were you even close in your guess? Don't forget to leave a comment about how many coils you thought it was going to take. Tularosa Black on White is a type of Cibola whiteware. The Cibola branch of the Anasazi, or ancestral Puebloans, is considered by some to be the ancestors of today's Zuni Pueblo people. Mineral painted black on white pottery started being made in the Cibola region around 550 AD. By the year 1000, this had evolved into complex designs featuring interplay between solid and hatched elements. It was at this time that the precursor to Tularosa, called Reserve Black on White, was made. As time went on, the solid black areas and the hatched areas became more balanced, and the overall design more refined. These changes led to the next type, Tularosa Black on White, which began to be made around 1150 AD. Tularosa is considered by many to be among the finest of the prehistoric southwestern pottery types. It was made and widely traded for 175 years. Around 1325, the popularity of whitewares, which had been the mainstay in the Cibola region for over 700 years, began to wane, replaced by redwares. This period marked the end of Cibola whiteware manufacture and the end of Tularosa Black on White. When this shift in pottery styles took place, the techniques used to make Cibola whiteware, such as that used to reduce the red iron paint to make black designs, were lost.
Okay, so third day on this project. My goal now is to get this dry, to get it dry evenly all over as soon as possible. Now remember, the puki it's sitting in is glass. And so while the top is drying, the bottom in that glass puki is not going to be drying, or at least not very fast. So I want to get it out of that puki as soon as possible. But I want to make sure that it's firm enough to hold its shape before I try lifting it out, because you could easily break it if you pull it out of the puki too soon. That's really the challenge at this point, is getting the top dry enough that it's firm enough that I can move it without breaking it, and then setting it on its side or something so that bottom can kind of air out. And then I'll wrap the top in plastic so the bottom can dry. How they did it in ancient times, I have no idea, but with a large jar, especially with a large jar in a puki that does not breathe, is a challenge. And I've been through this a few times because I've used this puki a few times. It's a large puki. So that's where I'm at today. Nothing really important to do today. No slipping or polishing or painting, although I'm getting to that. Today is drying, and drying carefully, and hopefully getting it out of that glass puki.
The key to getting this pot out of the puki this morning is to create a nice soft nest that's not going to flatten that bottom out. The whole pot at this point is still rather soft and malleable, and I don't want to change the shape. So as you can see, creating that nest like that with that soft bottom is going to support that rounded bottom without crushing it and allow it to dry evenly. And the other thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to take this sponge and just wet the upper portions of the pot that are getting too dry at this point, just to try to encourage even drying of the pot. On the fourth day, my goal is just to get that bottom of the pot cleaned up. Now that it's firm enough to sit on its edge without deforming it, the bottom has had zero attention since I stuck that clay in the puki at the very beginning. And so there's a little lip right at the edge of the puki, and there's little inconsistencies and divots all over it. So I'm just taking damp clay and pushing those into low spots. I'm using that deer rib to scrape off high spots. And you can see I'm getting there, but it's still a bit rough. Now I'm using that damp polishing stone just to give it an all over kind of smoothing. And even then, it's still got some divots in it. And so I'm going to make myself up a little slip. Slip made from the same clay that the pot is made from, except with no temper. And I'm just going to hit some of those spots that are not so great and just kind of build them up and kind of fill in gaps. And then I'm going to go back over it with the polishing stone just so that the bottom is as smooth and even as the top. Isn't it odd how that slip has a different color than the body clay? And now I'm ready to start stone smoothing the rest of the pot, now that the bottom's taken care of. And stone smoothing is just going to give me a nice, even, smooth consistency, ready to accept that slip that comes next. And you can see here that I missed my target entirely. I was going for something over 16 inches. I ended up somewhere around 15 inches, and it's not even done drying yet. Now this is that dry white clay that I'm going to apply as a slip over the outside of the pot. So before I wrap up today, I'm just going to put this in some water and let it start soaking so that hopefully by tomorrow when I need it, it's all nice and even and all the lumps have soaked out of it. And there's that slip, all smooth and almost ready to go. I'm just working the last of the lumps out of it before I start applying it. And you can see that even though the clay I built the pot from is fairly light in color, this material is a lot whiter than the gray clay I built from. Both of these clays come from real close by to each other in the same area on the Mogollon Rim, in an area where this type of pottery was probably made back in ancient times. So very authentic materials. And I'm just going to apply a couple of relatively thin coats over this gray clay just to whiten it up. And then the other thing I'm going to do today is polish it. So as soon as that slip is firm enough, dry enough that it doesn't stick to my polishing stone, then I can start just lightly going over it and giving it a nice polish. Now polishing, although it uses the same tool, a smooth stone, is different from stone smoothing. And so this is where you give it that shine.
Okay, here's where I'm at today. I'm just trying to let the pot dry slowly as possible. So I'm just kind of rotating it frequently and trying to keep a little bit of cotton cloth over the top to keep the air off of it so it'll dry more slowly. And that's just all I'm doing. So it's all done. It just needs to get fully dry before I paint it. I mean, you can paint it when it's not fully dry, but it's better when it's fully dry for a couple of reasons. For one thing, the dry clay body will wick away the moisture from the paint and help your paint dry more quickly so it's less likely to get smudged. And the other reason is you've got those pores in between the clay, the dry clay, and when you get those pigment minerals down in those pores, they're kind of locked in really good. So I think it's a little more permanent applying it dry as well. So that's where I'm at, and you can see the color difference on this. Places where it's drier than not, kind of grayer locations are where it's damper. The whiter locations are where it's dry. And you can see I had it wrapped up real good last night, but that rim is starting to look whiter than the neck. And that's why I put that plastic bag over the rim, because I don't want the neck. This is where you can get those rim cracks real easy if it dries faster than the rest of the pot. So you have to be really careful about exposing this to open air because you don't want that rim to crack. So that's where I'm at. The bottom is probably the wettest. As you can see, it's quite gray. So mostly what I'm trying to do is just dry it out evenly. So drying out the damper areas faster, drying the drier areas slower, and using some plastic bags and some handkerchief to kind of control that to some degree. And so this will be a couple of days of just solid drying, careful drying, and then I'll get to the painting.
Painting day. I'm going to try to use yucca paintbrushes just so the painting is authentic as well. And so I'm getting my yucca brushes out and kind of soaking them in water so they can soften those bristles. Mixing up my paint. Now my paint recipe here is 1 part red iron oxide, 1 part red clay, and just a touch of organic binder. In this case I'm using mesquite sap as that binder. And so I'm just doing the layout first, doing those big layout lines, and then I can fill those in with more detailed designs later on. I was coming down with the flu on this day, so I had a low-grade fever. It really kept me from focusing too much. And so as I start to paint these spirals, I realize I'm just no good at it right now. I just can't focus enough. So I waited several days till that fever was gone before I went back and painted those spirals. And before I started painting the spirals, I did a lot of practice spirals. And what I determined was I'm just no good at spirals. I did the best I could, and that was all I could be expected to do. They're not as good and as smooth as the originals, not as smooth as I would have liked. And the other concession I made on the spirals, because of the practice spirals, was that I'm going to use commercial brushes for the spirals. So as you watch me paint, you'll see that I'm using commercial brushes to paint the spirals, although I'm still using the Yucca brushes for everything else. But the nice thing about these complex geometric designs like this is they dazzle the eyes. So by the time I get all that detail filled in, you're probably not even going to notice my crummy spirals because your eyes are going to be dazzled by the entirety of the design. And so keep that in mind as you do it. If you have something you're not good at, wait till you're done and chances are nobody's even going to notice it. Now, second only to spirals in nerve-wrackingness are these hatching lines. And these took me a better part of a day to paint in. I mean, this video is sped up 8 times. So you got to take your time if you want these lines to be parallel and nice and even. And so it takes a lot of time to put in hatching lines. Now, again, that dazzling effect on your eyes is totally worth the time, but they are very nerve-wracking, and I have to take a lot of breaks because I get kind of edgy painting those kind of details. I made my first Tularosa Black on White Oya in the summer of 2021, and I spent a great deal of time building it, slipping it, painting it, and firing it, only to have it break into 100 pieces in the firing. So one of the questions I get a lot from people that have seen that video is, whatever happened to that pot that broke? Well, I collected all the pieces, all the little bits from that pot, and I put them in a sack. And I'm happy to say it was purchased by a student of mine, someone who took my workshop the next year, and he glued it back together. So the pot is glued back together and has a happy home in Pennsylvania. So you might be wondering why I painted the pot red when the original was black on white. Ancient Tularosa Black on White pottery was made using red iron oxide paint that was fired in such a way that that iron oxide reduced into black paint. There were actually a lot of cultures in the Southwest that fired pottery this way. So successfully reducing your red iron paint to black is something that I've been struggling with over the course of a few years. And I have a few videos on that. I'll put some of those down in the doobly-doo in case you're interested in learning more about reduced iron paint. I think I've pretty much got it figured out. The last one I did, which was almost a year ago, came out pretty good. So I'm going to use a similar process here. But there's actually been a number of different replicators that have been working on this same problem. And some of them are on YouTube. So Mark Gibson's Southwest Pottery has done some of this. Airstream Wanderings has touched on this subject. And Will O of Willow's Southwest Studio has probably done more reduced iron firings than anybody else at this point, certainly more than I have, and has had some good successes as well. So he's another one you should check out, and I will put the link to Will O's channel up above and in the doobly-doo so you can check that out. At any rate, reducing iron requires firing in a pit below ground level, and so that's why I started digging a hole. At this point, I'm just preheating the pot, getting it hot all over to drive out any remaining moisture that might be in the clay. I'm also heating up that cover sherd you see on the right there. Now I'm ready to stack the pot over those hot coals. Now I'm using really big rocks to stack the pot on. And the reason is the bottom of that pit, it's hard to get good airflow in there and oxidize the bottom of the pot. So I'm making sure the pot is raised up significantly above the coals so it can breathe good. I'm also putting my cover sherds on top of small rocks also. That way the cover sherds aren't right down on the ground. And again, we can get a little bit of airflow around those cover sherds, even on the bottom, especially on the bottom, because we want to make sure that the bottom of that pot gets plenty of oxygen. So now I'm placing the cover sherds all around it. I have to be really careful that I get full coverage on those sherds because later I'm going to put dirt in there, and I don't want that dirt getting on the pottery and causing black spots. So now I'm stacking the fuel. This is for the secondary fire, and I want to get a lot of wood on here because I want this pot to get nice and hot. And when it's down in a hole below the fire, it takes even more heat up above to get it hot enough down below. So here's a good healthy fire. This is all mesquite wood. I think there's a few sticks of something else in there, but 99% mesquite wood. Now I'm using some hot coals I set aside to kind of get it started. And this burned really hot. Because there was a little bit of a breeze, it really just fed that fire, and it just really got hot. Now I didn't measure the temperature of the firing. It's really hard to get a good measurement when the pot is down below ground level like that. And it was so hot at one point that you couldn't even hardly get close to it. So I really didn't measure. I know it got plenty hot, and I'll show you later the pot rings, so I know that as well. But really, I just trusted my instincts on this. The only time I really measured the temperature was once it had burned down to coals. Will O had suggested that you wait to smother it until the pot is around 500 degrees. And so at that point, once it's burned to coals, I was trying to wait until it was at that temperature. Now, I had never thought of measuring the temperature to set a margin on where it should be buried, but that's a good idea. What I had found is you have to let it sit and wait, even after it's done burning, for quite a while, because you want to make sure you get a chance to burn all that carbon off the pot and that it's nice and clean. So that waiting is really hard. So setting a temperature kind of allows me to have a target to aim toward and know when to bury it. So that's good. Okay, I just buried that fire, and it is 10:30 in the morning. So I'm going to give that at least 4 hours to sit there and kind of cool down. The rest of the time, I just got to stand around out here. I brought a book. This is my property, so I've got my ruins and stuff I can check out and other things I can hike around. So I'm just going to burn some time and let this pot cool off, and then we'll come back and see how it did. Big surprise waiting this afternoon out here. Okay, it's now been 5 hours since I buried that thing. I buried it at 10:30. It's now 3:30 in the afternoon. So I'm ready to take it out and go home. I still haven't decided whether it's best to leave these things overnight. I really wish that weren't the case, because leaving it overnight, causes a lot of stress and anxiety about something happening to it or a cow stepping on it. Probably mostly a cow stepping on it. Anyway, hopefully this 5 hours is enough. Let's open it up and see what we got. Oh, hot tamale. Can't see. 142, 100, 130, that's pretty low. There's a broken cover sherd. I hate breaking cover sherds. These things are not lasting well. Well, all right, here it is, all cooled off now. Rings like a bell, so fired nice and hard. I'm really happy with the blacks. I don't see any place where these oxidized into a reddish color. Maybe some areas might be a little blacker than others, but for the most part, I got good reduction. The ongoing problem that I've had, and others that are working on trying to get reduced iron paint, like Will O, who I mentioned, is carbon. There are places where it's real carbony, and you can see there's quite a fire cloud on the bottom there. Now, I believe those kind of things are usually caused by that dirt when I'm burying it, that dirt sliding in there, pushing things down in. I think smothering it is actually causing a lot of the carbon. As that dirt hits the hot coals, it's causing a certain amount of smoke. So my next goal, now that I've pretty much got the reduction figured out, is to try to figure out how to get these cleaner, how to get them to come out of the fire cleaner. So stay until the end, because I will take this home and clean it up, and I'll show some video there at the end of the cleaned up pot. Right now, it's kind of dirty. But overall, really happy with it. This is by far the largest pot in the Ancient Pottery Challenge this year. The other big one was that Pinto Polychrome bowl that I did. So with those two out of the way, I still have 4 pots in the challenge, but they're all relatively small pots. So The rest should be all downhill. I appreciate you coming with me today and watching my firing, and I'll catch you next time.